Welcome to Ham and Jam, the World War II British Airborne podcast, hosted by Andy Bryant and Kevin Getz.
All day long, the Canadians, with whom I'd pitched my tent, were playing games, throwing a ball about, and I thought, what tremendous vitality these Canadians have got. Then in the afternoon, I would visit my English battalions and find half a dozen chaps kicking a football and the rest asleep. I thought to myself, here is the difference between the old world and the new, the élan, the joie de vivre of the Canadians, and the maturity and the not bothering and having a good nap while we can of the British. And that, listeners, was Brigadier James Hill talking about his Canadians from the 1st Canadian Para right before D-Day. Welcome to another episode of Ham and Jam. I'm your co-host, often referred to as number 2 pilot, Kevin Getz, sitting alongside, navigating with my number 1 pilot, Andy Bryant. Andy, how you doing?
I'm doing really good, mate. Thanks. Now, you might be a pilot, but you're never a number 2.
And well, I appreciate that. I appreciate that very much. Well, we've been very blessed because we get this guest again. She's my favorite librarian from Canada. I should say favorite retired librarian from Canada. She's no longer in the employment circles. Norma Graham, how you doing?
Doing well, thanks, Kev. You can take the girl out of the library, but you can't really take the librarian out of the girl.
We wanted to have you on because I can't speak for Andy, but I'm sure he'll probably echo my thoughts. You joining us during varsity really kind of opened my eyes to what the Canadians were able to achieve. So we thought we got to have you back again to discuss everything Canadian and D-Day.
Well, I'm always happy to have an opportunity to talk about my boys.
That episode, Norma, has turned out to be one of our most popular.
It's probably because I keep listening to it, Andy.
So I'd encourage all our listeners, if you hadn't ever listened to that episode yet, to go back and listen to Norma's episodes about varsity and 1 Camp Para. It's a cracker.
Oh, it absolutely is. I know I've listened to it at least 3 or 4 times, and I'm always finding something new that I missed. I noticed that the Gov brought our drinks over to us. First, let's go. Norma, What do you have?
Well, I have recently discovered a wonderful de-alcoholized beer from Tleeman's, which is a brewery in Guelph, Ontario, quite close by me. I was at a conference a couple of weeks ago and I tried one of their zero beers and it is absolutely delicious.
Excellent. Andy, as if I have to really ask, just go ahead and show us the Guinness.
For our listeners, I might be holding a pint of Guinness, possibly.
For our listeners, I can confirm he is definitely holding a pint of Guinness.
Well, I hate to disappoint.
I'm going to go with the sparkling absolute vodka creme grape. As is customary, raise a glass. Cheers.
Cheers.
So, Norma, let me ask you this. I get a sense that these Canadians were very individual, rough and ready folks. Is that kind of who these guys were as they were anticipating on getting ready to go to the UK and then go into combat?
These guys, I think of them as boys, but I guess the young men, were raised during the Depression. Some of them in the Dust Bowl and the prairies, some of them in coal mining areas of the East Coast or forestry, the West Coast or mining in the North. A lot of them, they didn't have a lot of opportunity for things like higher education because the money just wasn't there. The opportunities weren't there. But I think being raised during the Depression made them uniquely resourceful people. And the selection process for 1st Can Para was so stringent that you got the best, you got the cream of the infantry, basically, in Canada. So they wouldn't necessarily have the formal education, but they were smart and they were resilient and they were resourceful. And they had a really strong belief in their own abilities. That was one of the things that they were sort of screened for, was people who were supremely self-confident. So I think that helped them with being successful later on as soldiers.
Is this also a similar background to many of those in the States who volunteered, who've never been outside of their own border?
There wasn't opportunities for them to be world travelers.
Sure.
They sometimes traveled for work, like to find work, because they finished school and there's no work, so they had to travel for work. But, they were young, right? They were 18, 19, 20, 22, 25. They were pretty innocent, I think, of the big world.
They've been formed. They're going over to the UK. When do they find out they are going to be active during Overlord?
It was May 31st of 1944, the first briefing that the battalion received. And Colonel Bradbrook, who was the Canadian commanding officer, said to them, "You're going to be surprised and happy when you learn all the things you're going to do on this operation. Believe me, there will be a part for every soldier here." There sure was. It was more than they bargained for. I guess he was trying to make it sound like it was going to be really fun, and it was not really fun at all. It was the end of May. They were put in a transit camp where there was guards that prevented them from leaving the camp. They had to stay put so that the word would not get out. There was going to be no leaks of information to the enemy. So they were in the transit camp for about a week before the invasion.
Who is Colonel Bradbrook? What kind of man is he?
Bradbrook was actually their second commanding officer. Their first commanding officer was named Proctor, and he was killed in the first jump at Fort Benning in Georgia. So Bradbrook became their commanding officer then. He was a good administrative officer. He was good training officer. He was not a good battle officer. He was not at the front as much as he should have been. And the men who were in the front saw a lot more Brigadier Hill than they did of their own commanding officers.
What are we looking at as far as training before the operation?
Their training was absolutely brutal. Long marches, long runs, in full gear, heavy packs. It was absolutely unrelenting. And it's a good thing it was, because it saved a lot of lives. It gave them the stamina that they needed for when Operation Tonga, which was the airborne part of Operation Overlord, took place. Well, that's the story. So I want to talk about what happened when they dropped. So they had been training for almost 2 years, some of them in 3 different countries. They were a bit innocent, but certainly full of energy, as the quote from Brigadier Hill certainly illustrates. And in the weeks before the Normandy landings, they went along with the rest of 3rd Brigade and were leaning into their training, wanting to give his men every advantage. Brigadier Hill ensured every man was thoroughly and repeatedly briefed. They had dioramas and models set up and loads of photo reconnaissance. He gave all of the officers some general instructions about leading men in battle. My favorite one is, there are at least 2 solutions for every problem. You will always choose the simpler one. Simplicity ensures speed, control, and efficiency, and therefore obtains effect. So that's good advice for life and war. But he was very concerned about his Canadian battalion because they were not professional soldiers. You know, they've been training a long time, but he was worried about how they'd be. He was very fatherly to them. Anyway, their objectives for 1st Canberra filled in a piece of the picture that was the airborne plan, that was Operation Tonga. And that was to interdict the enemy from assaulting the men landing on the beaches. So the idea is protect the men who are coming in on ships and landing on Sword Beach and Juno Beach from the Germans coming up from the south. So they had a very important job. The American 82nd Airborne and 101st Airborne, they were to land on the west side of the landing beaches to protect Omaha, Utah beach guys. And 6th Airborne was on the eastern side to protect Sword and Juno. So east of the Canadian drop zone, which was drop zone B, there was no friendly presence there at all. There was just enemy. So they were the furthest east of any of the airborne landing zones. So each company, A, B, and C, had their tasks. Company A was to protect the left flank of the 9th Battalion as it took out the guns of the Merville Battery. And of course, if anyone out there has not read Neil Barber's brilliant book, The Day the Devils Dropped In, about 9th Battalion, read it.
It's funny you should say that, Norma, because Neil is actually on an upcoming episode talking about that book and the assault on Merville Battery. So
yeah. So Merville Battery had to be taken out because those guns would just massacre the men coming in on the beaches if it was not taken out. Now, protecting another unit's flank does not sound like much of much. So some of the guys in A Company were kind of disappointed, but Brigadier Hill felt it was really important because he was anxious about how the enemy was going to protect those guns. And so having protection on the flank of 9th Battalion as they took those guns out was actually a really important job. Company B was to clear and guard the route to the bridge at Robon so that an attached unit of Royal Engineers could come in and blow it up, thus preventing it or at least slowing the German tanks and artillery from getting to the beaches. And they were also to seize the Le Mesnil crossroads to stop the enemy from using the main coastal highway running inland to Caen. Le Mesnil was going to be the gathering point and defensive position for 1 Canberra and the brigade headquarters. So it was a really important position. And it sat on the high ground overlooking the beaches at Ouistreham. C Company was to take over a manor house and outbuildings near Variville that had been taken over by German forces as a barracks and a headquarters. They were also to support the engineers that were to blow up the bridge at Variville. Now, part of C Company jumped with the Pathfinders of the 22nd Independent Parachute Company before everybody else. So they actually landed before midnight, June 5th. So that made them first on the ground in the Normandy invasion. So they were to guard the Pathfinders as they set up the beacons on Drop Zone V for when the planes came in with the rest of the battalion and the rest of the brigade. So all companies were to rendezvous at Le Mesnil once their objectives were attained and hold there. So these were the tasks as 541 young Canadians set out for France on the night of June 5th, 6th to drop into history. Well, there's a quote from Dan Hardigan. If they'd known how badly the 6th Airborne was scattered, they would have despaired. But each little group thought it was only them. They didn't discover the truth until much later, but the hard knock just galvanized them, and in their small groups, they were determined to achieve their objectives, come hell or high water. And believe me, there was both hell and high water involved. It's a well-known story now that the paratroops that jumped in the wee hours of June 6th were widely scattered, and the Canadians probably worst of all. And it made their tasks a lot more difficult. When C Company jumped with the Pathfinders to mark Drop Zone V, they discovered that all but 2 of the lights that were to be used to guide the aircraft to the drop zone were damaged or lost in the jump. According to the historian of 46th Group, RAF, to which several of the aircraft belonged, the lack of expected ground signals, the pall of dust and smoke blown across the run-in and the dropping zone, and some troublesome flak combined to produce the scattered landings. It seems, however, that uncertain navigation, the lack of prominent landmarks, and the prevalence of veering winds were also important factors. So of the 34 sticks that were the main body of 1st Canberra, 7 landed on the drop zone out of 34. 5 were dropped within a mile of it, 6 were dropped within 2 miles, and 16 were over 2 miles away. And 1, with Lieutenant Cote, was actually dropped near Le Havre, so that's like 60 miles away from where they were supposed to be. And to the end of his days, I guess, Lieutenant Cote was never sure if it was an accident or if they were dropped there on purpose to fake out the Germans, because they were almost immediately taken prisoner of war. And the Germans that had them kept asking, why are you dropping here? Why are you dropping here? And they're like, we didn't mean to. So
I wanted to ask you, Norma, these guys could easily be in 2 camps of, oh, holy crap, what are we going to do? Or do you think this independent spirit, these men of the Depression, this is just one more challenge in life that we've had to face, and you know what? Let's just get on with it.
It's certainly the latter. But in the interview with Lieutenant John Madden, his first thought when they landed and there was nobody else around, well, maybe they called it off again, but they dropped us before they called it off and we're stuck here. Oh, well. So Dan Hardigan wrote, to say that the 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion drop was a disaster is to understate the situation. Out of over 500 men, less than 100 were on the drop zone. 140 soldiers were spread out near the coast over a distance of 90 kilometers, as I say, almost to Le Havre. Now, the distance for most of the men wasn't that big a deal. These guys were used to 50-mile yomps. They were super fit, and if they could figure out where they were, they would be okay. You know, they just had to figure that out, and they all had different stories of how that happened. But those dropped in flooded areas. There was a lot of flooded areas just south of where they were supposed to drop. The Germans had flooded the Deep River and created these really marshy areas. And there was also these farm canals that were quite deep in some cases. So a lot of those guys didn't fare too well. One of the ones that was dropped in the water was actually Brigadier Hill. And he remembered that he was in 4 feet of water. It took hours to get out of the water because they had these heavy packs on. And he had sewn a whole lot of tea bags into his clothing. So he stood there in this deep, fetid water making cold tea. He was not impressed. Anyway, there was a Sergeant Kelly, young fella, who, when he came down, he got wedged in a dead tree over water head first. And he had this 60-pound pack on his back that was shoving him down into the crook of this tree, and his head was underwater. So he kept having to lift his head up out of the water and take a breath and then drop back down and then lift up. And he was almost to the point of complete exhaustion. He was going to give up. And one of the other first Camp Para guys came along and rescued him.
Andy, for our listeners who've never been there, I know you've been there several times. Give us a sense of that terrain.
As Norma said, it's quite flat. It's open because you're to the east of the Breville Ridge. And as Norma has said, the Germans had flooded the Deeps Valley. And the roads with the bridges that we're going to talk about form causeways, basically. So taking those bridges out going to be really important. But yeah, it's actually quite flat and open with fields. And the actual river that these bridges are over, the banks are really steep. So although some of them aren't very wide, if you take the bridge out, armoured vehicles are not going to be able to ford it. The bank is so steep.
It's very pastoral land. So a lot of these guys had some close encounters in the dark with some cows. They're thinking, oh God, it's Germans. But it wasn't. It was cows.
I've written Cornelius Ryan's book, The Longest Day, that this was slime, water, and that's why you see these guys that are not able to get out of their chutes fast enough. They're drowning, or they're sinking in the mud and they're killed.
There were a number that were drowned, and some were never found either. Nobody knew what happened to them because they were never found. And one of the medical officers, Dr. Colin Brebner, he came down in a tree, and it was dark, of course, and he didn't know how far he really was off ground. He had to cut himself loose because he had no other way of getting out of this tree because the way he was tangled up. And he fell several feet. And when he went to get up, he realized he'd broken his wrist. He thought, okay, I'm a medical officer. One hand, I can probably do something helpful. So he stood up to start walking and fell again because he had broken his pelvis falling from the tree. And he ended up being taken prisoner by the enemy, but was freed a few weeks later when France was liberated. So he wasn't in captivity for very long, but by varsity, he was back working again. The other terrible thing that happened, First Camp Para lost 70% of their weapons and equipment, including communications equipment, radios. Airborne troops can only carry light weapons, right? So Bren guns, mortars, pistols, rifles. Mm-hmm. They lost even most of that due to the leg bags. They were given leg bags. They're like a 20-foot rope on them, and they were supposed to let the bag down with the rope just before they landed. But the bags weren't sturdy enough. And when they started letting them down, the bottom of the bag tore, and they just watched their weapons and their ammunition falling into the water. So they were left mostly weaponless and lost in the dark amongst an unseen enemy, and had to get back to try and find the rest of the company in the dark, surrounded by enemy. Anyway, each of them at first thought that it was only their stick that was affected, but then as they moved through the night heading for where they wanted to go, they kept picking up strays, and they ended up with groups of soldiers, some from various battalions, some British, some Canadian. So it was a real mixture. So Dan Hardigan remembered when they found themselves misplaced, and even worse as they continued to find others who were also misplaced, uncertainty about their ability to achieve their goals crept in. Some also felt if they could not reach their objectives on time, they would be letting their friends down. And above all, they needed time, but time had run out. But when we look back now, it is apparent that shortly after the drop, the scattering of the battalion produced a positive phenomenon. And the very traits of character which motivated the men to volunteer for parachute training to begin with now impelled them to respond to the new adversity, which added resources of resolution, determination, and just plain guts. The very threat of defeat evidently summoned from the distant reaches of their collective being an escalation of fortitude, a rising of courage. So as the men who could find their way back towards the drop zone began to coalesce in twos and threes and then in larger groups, they often found themselves connecting with men of other units of the 6th Airborne. So I love this story. It's quite a funny story of how Dan Hardigan and another man, Eddie Mallon from 1 Can Para, were trying to get back to their drop zone when they ran into 7 men from the 9th Battalion, including a lieutenant. At about 2:30 a.m., they joined Colonel Otway and the 9th Battalion. Now, Colonel Otway is not known for his patience and good nature, shall we say. And he's under a lot of stress, right? Because he's supposed to be doing the Merville Battery, and he has no men. So the lieutenant announced to Colonel Otway he'd arrived with his 6 men plus 2 Canadians. Otway demanded, "What good are they?" The lieutenant answered that the Canadians seemed very good. Otway responded, "They don't know a damn thing. And I say again, what good are they?" So Eddie Mallon, who was a hard rock miner from Northern Ontario, was getting his dander up and blurted out, "We're just as good as any goddamn cotton-picking limey." There was a deathly silence as the British colonel digested this comment. Colonel Otway was, shall we say, unaccustomed to a private speaking this way to him. The lieutenant ventured to ask what to do with the 2 Canadians, and Otway sputtered for a while and then shouted, "Send the blighters back to where they bloody well come from." Hardigan did understand later that when Otway said they didn't know anything, he was referring to the fact that he had put 9th Battalion through days and days and days of really detailed training for the Merville Battery operation, and they didn't know anything about that. He forgave the colonel treatment of himself when he realized that Otway was about to try and take the battery with about 180 of the 700 men that he was supposed to have to do the work. Anyway, the lieutenant gave Hardigan and Mallon instructions on how to get to Verraville, which is where they were supposed to be, and they arrived as dawn was breaking. So meanwhile, the few men that C Company's Major Murray McLeod had been able to put together, apparently only about 20, were taking care of their objectives. McLeod, a former bank teller from Nova Scotia, had turned out to be a born leader, and his men would and did follow him into hell. Dan Hardigan recounted, had things gone right, McLeod would have had over 100 men in position, armed with 9 light machine guns, 16 submachine guns, 1 Piat, 9 2-inch mortars, and a dozen Bangalore torpedo lengths, in addition to 90 riflemen. Instead, having dispatched the small reconnaissance patrols to Petittville and to the little bridge on the Devet that they were supposed to be blowing up, he began his assault on the Verraville gatehouse with only 11 men and next to no equipment at all because it had all been lost. Some men took care of blowing up the bridge over the Devet, and the rest went to the chateau near Verraville to knock out a German stronghold, gathering up another 6 men along the route. The gatehouse was being used by the Germans as a barrack and communications center, and when they arrived, the barracks was empty, but the beds were still warm. McLeod and his company, which was about a platoon's worth in numbers at this point, took over the gatehouse and viewed the surrounding area. There was an enemy trench opposite the gatehouse, which they took to hold just machine guns and anti-tank rifles until an armor-piercing shell hit the ground floor of the gatehouse. The 3 men there escaped the choking dust out the back of the gatehouse. The only serious weapon McLeod's group now held was a Piat. The Piat crew sent over a Piat bomb, which sadly fell short. Before they could reload, a high explosive shell hit the top floor of the gatehouse, igniting the remaining Piat bombs. The explosion killed 5 of the 7 men in the room, including Major McLeod. A short time later, Dan Hardigan had to enter the room to get a good look out at the enemy emplacements, and he recalls seeing parts of men, his friends, young men like himself, now in bits all over the room. He pushed the shock aside and kept going. There were some extremely tense hours as the men in the Chateau Verraville gatehouse waited to see if the Germans would be able to summon backup. But the blown bridges prevented tanks and armored vehicles from getting there, and Captain Hansen, who had taken over for Major McLeod, was finally able to convince the Germans to surrender. The Canadian medical officer gave aid to the German wounded. About 40 determined paratroopers with very few weapons were able to overcome about 80 well-armed enemy just by convincing them that they didn't have a chance. It was just about a miracle. But the loss of Murray McLeod was a real blow to his company, who held him in such high regard. Brigadier Hill had a hellish few hours following the drop. As with most others, he was dropped a distance from the drop zone and into a flooded area of the Dee River. He managed to gather up 42 men, many of whom had to be assisted out of the water as they struggled with their heavy packs. British Private Emile Cortale and his paradog Glenn were among them. It took Hill and this motley collection 4 hours to reach the drop zone. No one there knew how things stood at the Merville Battery, about which Hill was most anxious. So he set out with some men to find out. Tragically, a bomb dropped by an RAF aircraft hit the group, killing several, including Corte and Glenn the dog. Hill was badly wounded. He had basically his left buttock blown off, which is, that's the biggest muscle in your body, and he had it pretty much bisected, and several others wounded and killed. Hill was treated for his injuries, but insisted on being returned to his men as quickly as possible.
I had a question with regards to Major McLeod. Obviously, you had said he was highly regarded and much beloved. You had talked about Hill being this father figure. Here's McLeod being almost like a father figure to these 18, 19-year-old kids.
McLeod was just 25 himself. But the way that he talked about, it's like he just had some ineffable something that made him a natural leader of men. Just an amazing guy and such a terrible loss.
Yeah, that's incredible knowing that he's only 6 or 7 years older than these guys.
Yeah, I mean, Karen Otway, the CO of 9th Battalion, he was only 29 and he's a colonel.
And he's cranky.
He wasn't in a good mood that night. He
had a tough time. I managed to get it done, but I think by the time he'd finished at the Merville Battery, he only had maybe 65 guys left who were not wounded or dead. So it was pretty harrowing. So meanwhile, that's the thing about talking about the airborne in Normandy, is that there's so many moving parts that just try to get your head around it, because there's just so many things going on. And I don't think I'll ever get over being absolutely astonished at the level of planning that went into this operation. They thought of everything. And even the snafus, they could work with that. They could work around it. But the level of planning is mind-blowing. Anyway. So Lieutenant Norm Tosland and B Company were getting after their objective, which was to blow up the Robon Bridge. Only 30 of his men managed to gather at the rendezvous point. They headed for the bridge and met up with 2 other officers, Major Fuller and Captain Griffin, with a small group of British and Canadians from other companies and battalions. They waited at the bridge until 3 a.m., but the engineers who were supposed to arrive to blow the bridge hadn't shown up. They had also been dropped too far east. So they passed the hat for all the explosives that they happened to have on them and used that to try to blow the bridge. Now, the war diary says that they were successful in blowing the bridge, but other sources say that the bridge was just weakened, and then the engineers finally showed up and blew the bridge properly. And so after that was done, they left some of the men there to guard and dig in there, and the rest of them headed for the rendezvous at Le Mesnil crossroads. It was imperative that the crossroads at Le Mesnil be held. The eastern flank of the invasion force coming in from the beach was depending on the men of 6th Airborne for protection, and the various units of the division had to make a contiguous defensive perimeter. To quote Colonel Bernhorn, who's written extensively about 1st Canberra, the goal was to form an impregnable bulwark which would frustrate any and every attempt the Germans might make to force their way into the newly formed left flank of the Allied invasion bridgehead. 1st Canberra was situated between 8th and 9th battalions in this wall that they were trying to create to protect the beaches. This was a vital hinge point, and 1st Canberra's headquarters was set up here right across from the brigade HQ. And I think probably, I don't know this for sure, but it just kind of makes sense to me that Brigadier Hill was concerned about the Canadians with this being their first action. So he wanted his headquarters right near the Canadian headquarters. So if help was needed, he would be right there. I don't know that for sure, though. That's an assumption. Their time was taken up mostly with fighting off sporadic German counterattacks and sending out patrols and raids to keep the enemy guessing. Fraser Eady recalled, if there was no fighting going on, Brigadier Hill made sure there was patrolling. He wanted to impart the superiority of our troops. He never wanted the enemy to rest. And the other thing was that these guys, they're keyed up, lots of nervous energy. He didn't want them sitting in slit trenches and becoming deconditioned and not keeping sharp. So he kept them out patrolling. So the flooding and blown bridges meant that enemy armor was restricted in movement, so that the battle around Le Mesnil developed into kind of a guerrilla warfare. When the headquarters signals officer, J.A. Simpson, when he came down in his drop, he lost his radio gear and his 4 pigeons in the drop. So when he arrived at 1st Canberra headquarters at Le Mesnil, Colonel Bradbrook sent him to look for comms equipment because they only had 1 working radio at this point. He found field telephone lines and equipment, but just about as soon as they put down the lines, the mortar round would come in and blow it to smithereens. So they ended up having to repair lines just about constantly. In Dan Hartigan's A Rising of Courage, he vividly describes the experience of the paratroopers the first few nights after D-Day. They strained all night to control the enemy's attempts to delineate their actual positions. Hour after hour, the paratroopers peered into the darkness in an attempt to differentiate between fact and fiction as conditions for mirage activity set in. Thirst, lack of sleep, fear, dehydration, and grief for killed or missing friend. So have you ever been out at night looking for something or looking at something and like, is that what I think it is? Is that moving? And these guys were under incredible stress. They were exhausted and dehydrated and, they were seeing things in the dark or they weren't sure what they were seeing. When the paratroopers who defended the Le Mesnil position that night tried to adjust their bleary, unblinking eyes and stared at the risen morning sun of the 8th of June, it was more than 72 hours after they'd awoken in England. The depth of exhaustion was as cruel as physical pain, and there was no end in sight. The wooded countryside, with thick, high hedges and trees, meant that the 1 Canberra Indigenous members and others who'd spent their youth in the Canadian wilderness had a distinct advantage when it came to bushcraft. John Madden recalls how, with great admiration, I must say, how one of his Indigenous comrades, whose last name was Boland, he could kind of disappear into the background and you would think you were all alone and you'd move to go forward and suddenly he'd appear from behind a tree or from some other ways where he'd been hiding, observing, ready to go forward with you. So one rather important interruption to all this sneaking around in the dark that they were doing and all of the guerrilla warfare. On June 12th, and this is what Neil Barber writes so well about in The Day the Devils Dropped In. The 5th Black Watch had been sent in to support 9th Battalion, which was holding the area around Chateau St. Côme. Have you been there, Andy?
Many times, yes, Norma, I have, yeah.
So you know the story of that. They were sent forward to drive the Germans out of the area, but they were getting mown down and driven back towards the chateau. Things were very bad, and Colonel Otway sent word to the brigadier that they were running low on ammo and mortar bombs, and they were seeing the Black Watch being driven back. Brigadier Hill knew that Otway would not ever call for help unless the situation was desperate. Even though the area around Le Mesnil being defended by 1 Canberra was being very hard pressed at that time, Brigadier Hill asked Colonel Bradbrook if he could spare a few men to go assist the 9th Battalion. Hill recounted to Neil Barber, at that moment, German tanks had overrun the road to his right and were shooting up his company HQ at close range. To his eternal credit, he decided he could deal with this problem and gave me what was left of his reserve company under Major Hanson, together with cooks and any spare men, and we set off. So combing out the battalion to try and find some guys to go and be the cavalry to ride to the rescue at Chateau St. Côme. So Hill and the approximately 60 men that he could gather up headed off to give what support they could. Led by Hill, who was still recovering from that terrible wound, the Canadians fixed bayonets and began to sweep the woods of the enemy. And Private Jean de Vries remembered, in the run to the chateau, as the noise of battle increased and with more shells and bullets flying around, I remember feeling not very heroic, but seeing the brigadier totally exposed and urging us on gave me a feeling of resolve. The Germans began to regroup for another attack, but the brigadier called through coordinates for support from 2 Allied ships in the Channel, and the resulting barrage halted the enemy advance. The situation remained serious, so Hill sent some of his Canadians up to the chateau to ensure it was firmly held. There are, of course, a lot of stories to tell. As I say, there are So many moving parts in this. The story of Lieutenant Cote, who was dropped near Le Havre, is an interesting story. And yeah, there's just a lot of ends in the story of One Can Para and Normandy. But this first week after D-Day remains among the most dramatic tales of war, I think, that's ever been told. 6th Airborne remained in Normandy until after the Germans were chased out in August. They took part in what was called Operation Paddle, which basically was again sort of a wall of allies shoving the Germans eastward. Madden said that One Can Para guys thought they were going to be in Normandy for 4 days, and then they would be withdrawn and prepared for another airborne operation. But because there was such rapid progress of the Allies across Normandy, they just stayed and acted as ground troops. They were just infantry, to the point where they were given some replacement troops who were just infantry. They were not paratroopers. They sent in some further assistance to them, but not paratroopers. So 3 months later, they finally get back to Beaufort to rest and refit and start training for the next operations. That training, which had seemed so very brutal and relentless, saved the lives of the men who survived the Normandy ordeal by giving them the strength and the stamina that was required. So out of the original 541 Canadians of One Can Para, who were among the first to begin reclaiming Western Europe from the Nazis, only 4 officers and 193 other ranks returned to Carter Barracks on September 6th. Casualties for the battalion were 83 killed, 187 wounded, 84 captured. And a lot of those captured were because of the scattered drop. They ended up dropping right into the middle of a bunch of enemy. Of One Can Para, Gale wrote, "It was a great day for us when the Canadian government deemed it fit to place the 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion under my command. You know how magnificently that battalion has done. The survivors had almost 9 more months of fighting ahead of them, but they were now blooded veterans, both toughened and schooled by what they'd experienced. These young men were well on their way to becoming professional soldiers."
Definitely. It's just to go back, it's interesting when you said about the replacements that were coming through with just regular infantry from the depots, because a lot of those across 6th Airborne were the actual Canada officers, because Canada had a surplus of officers and Britain didn't. So a lot of the replacement officers that went in the 6th Airborne were from Canada.
Norma, have you been able to find the immediate assessment from others as far as 1st Can Para's effort?
Churchill referred to them as those magnificent Canadians. And Montgomery, when he was giving medal, he said of them, every man an emperor. So they were well thought of. Certainly Richard Gale, as I said, was favorably impressed with how they'd done. And Brigadier Hill, of course, was very much over the moon about how well his Canadians had done. I think that would have meant more to them than anything, to have Brigadier Hill's approval than to have fine words from anybody else.
It's interesting with Hill because he was quite prophetic, wasn't he, before the actual D-Day drop, when he spoke to his officers and said, I'm probably going to get this quote wrong, but he said, "Gentlemen, do not be surprised if chaos reigns. It undoubtedly will." And how right he was.
Yes, absolutely. I don't think he was even expecting it to be that bad. It was a tough assignment to achieve their goals, even if they'd had all the men and all the equipment and all the weapons and all the ammunition. But they had to do it with, in some cases, a very minimal fraction of what they were supposed to have to do this work. And I mean, that held for the other battalions in 3rd Brigade as well, that they managed to do a great deal with very little.
Absolutely.
And the story of One Can Para in Normandy is how they managed to pull it off.
Is it a story that is known in Canada?
Only to we who know the history, and not very many people do. I'm trying to change that, but I'm only one little old lady, so.
There is an excellent docudrama out there called Storming Juno.
You can watch it on YouTube.
Yeah, I think I've got it on DVD, I think. But yeah, it's an excellent docudrama, Storming Juno. It covers 1st Can Para and it also covers the actual invasion beaches as well. I'd highly recommend that. Highly recommend it.
After listening to Norma talking about what 1st Can Para did during adversity and what they were able to achieve in the D-Day drops is just absolutely extraordinary. It really speaks to the resolve and the human spirit of Canadians. This can-do, go-to-it attitude of we can survive and do anything.
Yeah, I mean, there's this thing about the UK always punching above its weight, but I think Canada punches a heck of a lot.
The men who came in on Juno Beach achieved some pretty amazing results at a very high cost. If people ask me why I do what I do, the good society and the freedom that we have in Canada was purchased with the blood of those men. So I owe them at least this. It's a small thing, but just tell their stories. Keep telling the stories.
Well, on that note, unless there's any more from you, Kev?
Nope, I can't think of any better way to finish it than with what Norma said.
Great. So yeah, the landlord's looking across, folks, and it just remains for me to say thank you so much, Norma, for joining us again.
My pleasure. Lovely to see you both.
Thanks for our listeners for tuning in to another episode of Ham and Jam, but we're going to call time, gentlemen, please, on this episode, and it just remains for us to say cheers.
Cheers.
And
Ham and Jam.
Thanks for listening to Ham and Jam. If you enjoyed this episode and want to help Andy and Kevin make more, please support us on buymeacoffee.com.
you've got to go with that Tom Cruise thing, mate.
Oh, geez. Don't even go there.